In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean lies an island that has magnetically drawn the gaze of researchers, historians, and travelers from around the world for centuries. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it was called by its indigenous people, seems as if nature itself concealed it from prying eyes, placing it at the very edge of the inhabited world. Just imagine, the nearest land, the tiny island of Pitcairn, with a population of only a few dozen people, is about 1,240 miles to the west. And Rapa Nui is separated from the nearest mainland, the coast of Chile, by almost 2,200 miles of boundless ocean. These figures embody not just remoteness, but a true mystery, a challenge thrown down by nature itself. How could it be that such an isolated patch of land gave rise to a unique civilization, bequeathing to humanity hundreds of enigmatic stone statues? The island itself is small. Its area is approximately 62 square miles. That is even smaller than the territory of many modern megacities. And yet, on this small territory, events unfolded that fundamentally influenced not only the fate of its inhabitants, but also our understanding of the development of ancient cultures. Practically every corner of this island is steeped in history, making us think about the fundamental questions of our past. What are the origins of civilizations? What determines their flourishing? And what mysterious circumstances lead to their decline and disappearance? Before we delve into the mysteries of the monumental statues known as moai, it is important to understand how this island, lost in the ocean and completely unknown to Europeans, received its modern name. This happened in 1722. On a Sunday morning, April 5th, the ships of the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen approached the shores of the island. Land that was not on any of the known maps of the time became an unexpected discovery for the expedition. The crew members were amazed by the sight of huge stone statues towering along the coast and directing their gazes into the interior of the island. No less surprising was that the island was discovered on the very day of the celebration of Christian Easter. Deciding to immortalize this momentous event, Captain Jacob Roggeveen, without hesitation, gave this land the name Easter Island. He himself could not have imagined then that this accidental and rather superficial name would forever be enshrined in the geographical atlases of the world, despite the fact that the indigenous people and their ancestors called their homeland differently, Rapa Nui, which translates as Big Island. Thus, chance entered history and became an integral part of it. But beneath this seemingly random name lies a much deeper, more ancient, and more enigmatic history that we are only beginning to study. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already done so. There are many more interesting videos ahead, and we will continue further. Ahead of us is a story about the people who conquered the vast ocean expanses, about a civilization that seemed to have arisen against the laws of nature, and about the mysterious stone giants who still, after centuries, keep their silent secrets. It is time to embark on a journey to the very edge of Earth, and time to uncover the story of an island that has itself become a legend. When the first Europeans set foot on Easter Island, they were struck not only by the grandeur of the stone statues, but also by the very fact that human life existed here. After all, the island is located so far from any continents, and even from the nearest islands, that it seemed almost impossible to imagine how people could have crossed these vast expanses of water in simple wooden canoes. At a time when European seafarers were just beginning to make plans for long sea voyages, the Polynesians were already confidently traversing thousands of miles of ocean, without compasses, navigation charts, or any written instructions. Their only helpers were the stars, the winds, the ocean currents, and a deep understanding of natural laws passed down from generation to generation. The question that has occupied the minds of scientists for centuries is, where did these pioneers of the Pacific Ocean come from? Thanks to numerous studies and the comparison of archaeological, anthropological, and genetic data, we can finally answer this question. Today, most experts agree that the first settlers of Easter Island arrived in the period between approximately 700 and 1200 AD. Presumably, the starting point of their journey was the Marquesas Islands, located approximately 2,200 miles to the northwest of Rapa Nui. It was from there, driven either by necessity or by a thirst for discovery, that they set off on a long journey in search of new lands. But what made the Polynesians embark on such a risky expedition? Researchers have several hypotheses on this matter. According to one of them, the reason for the resettlement was overpopulation and depletion of resources on their native islands. Another version suggests that the cause may have been intertribal conflicts, forcing one of the groups to leave their lands in search of safe haven. Whatever the true reason, one thing remains undeniable. The courage and seafaring skills of these ancient seafarers are admired to this day. What happened after the arrival of the first settlers on the island? Were they able to create a sustainable society, and what difficulties did they have to overcome? There is also a third hypothesis, perhaps the most romantic of all, which suggests that the resettlement to Easter Island was a deliberate act of exploration, in the spirit of the great explorers of antiquity. The driving force behind these people was the desire to expand the boundaries of the known world, to find new lands where they could settle, build a new life, and create a unique culture. Modern anthropological, and in particular genetic studies, reveal an unexpected and amazing page in the history of Rapa Nui, discovering a mysterious connection between the inhabitants of the island and the peoples of South America. In the mid-20th century, the outstanding Norwegian researcher Thor Heyerdahl put forward a hypothesis that caused heated discussions in scientific circles. He argued that the first settlers of Easter Island may have arrived here not from Polynesia, as previously thought, but from the territory of South America. In support of his theory, he undertook the famous expedition on the raft Kon-Tiki, built from balsa logs in the image and likeness of the ancient South American Indians. Despite the successful crossing of the Pacific Ocean from the coast of Peru to Polynesia, most anthropologists and archaeologists initially viewed Heyerdahl's hypothesis with skepticism. Nevertheless, further research and discoveries have shown that Easter Island's ties to South America are much deeper and more complex than previously thought. The most convincing evidence confirming the connection with South America has been the findings and genetic studies conducted in the 21st century. In the genetic code of the inhabitants of Rapa Nui, to the surprise of scientists, traces of South American origin were found. Moreover, the data indicate that contact between the inhabitants of the island and South America occurred long before the arrival of Europeans in the Pacific Ocean, possibly between the 13th and 15th centuries. This suggests that the ancient Polynesians not only explored the vastness of the ocean, but also made long journeys in both directions, maintaining active ties with the peoples of another continent. Archaeological finds on the island also confirm the existence of links with South America. In particular, a variety of sweet potato, batat, which originates from South America and was not previously found in Polynesia, was discovered on Rapa Nui. But even more intriguing is the fact that archaeologists have repeatedly found ancient chicken bones on the coast of Peru and Chile that are genetically related to Polynesian species of birds. Chickens were domestic birds in Polynesia, and their discovery on the American continent raises a serious question for researchers. Who was the first to cross the vast Pacific Ocean, and how many times was this route made in both directions? However, perhaps the most amazing and mysterious evidence remains the art of the ancient inhabitants of Rapa Nui. Some scientists note the similarity in the images and motifs of the islanders' art with the art of the pre-Columbian civilizations of South America. Particular attention is drawn to the image of a person sitting in a pose characteristic of ancient Andean cultures. Similar sculptures have been found both on Easter Island and on the continent, which makes one think about a possible cultural exchange. about the exchange of ideas, myths, and even religious practices between peoples who were long considered completely isolated from each other. To date, the question of the interaction between Easter Island and South America remains open and causes lively discussions. Most modern researchers agree that the Rapa Nui civilization was formed on a Polynesian basis, but regular contacts with South America could have had a significant impact on its cultural development. It is possible that voyages across the ocean were rare, risky, and episodic, but they still left their mark on the genes and culture of the islanders. However, the inhabitants of Easter Island themselves had their own, no less fascinating version of how they ended up on this land. According to local legend, the history of Rapa Nui begins in the distant mythical country of Hiva, located somewhere in the west, in the very heart of Polynesia. Hiva was a prosperous and fertile land where people lived in abundance and well-being. But over time, times of discord, strife, and destructive wars came. Chief Hotu Matua, the ruler of one of the tribes, received a prophetic dream from a sage in which he was warned about the coming catastrophe. In the dream, the sage showed him a distant island in the middle of the boundless ocean, which was to become salvation for his people. Hotu Matua believed the prophecy. He gathered his most devoted people and ordered them to build huge sea canoes capable of withstanding a long journey across the ocean. Together with him, he decided to take his whole family, plants, animals, and everything necessary for a new life. Several canoes set off on the journey, including the ship of the chief himself, filled with sacred objects and relics. The journey was incredibly difficult and long. The legend says that the travelers were guided by the stars and birds flying high in the sky, listened to the voice of the ocean, and tried not to lose the right direction. There was even talk of the existence of a legendary bird sent by the gods that pointed the way to the new land. Did Hotu Matua and his people succeed in reaching their promised island? And what awaited them on this new land? During this arduous voyage, they faced raging storms, debilitating doldrums, and moments of profound despair when it seemed the prophecy was nothing more than an illusion. But finally, after countless days and nights, the long-awaited land described in the prophetic dream appeared on the horizon. Tradition has preserved the name of the bay where the settlers' canoes landed, Anakina, a place that endures on Easter Island to this day. It was here, on the pristine white sands of a beach fringed with coconut palms, that Hotu Matua first set foot. He was the first to disembark, becoming the founder of the settlement and, according to legend, the island's first king. The legend continues its narrative, recounting how Hotu Matua and his companions divided the island into different territories, establishing tribes that became the ancestors of all subsequent generations of Rapa Nui people. Every lineage, every family on the island could later trace their ancestry directly back to Hotu Matua himself. Thus, this myth did not merely tell the story of one man's heroic feat, but also united all the island's inhabitants, creating in them a sense of shared roots and a common destiny. However, a natural question arises. Is the legend of Hotu Matua a historical fact? Or is it simply a poetic image created to explain the origin of the people? Contemporary historians and anthropologists believe that such legends invariably contain a grain of actual events, which over time have been transformed and imbued with mystical elements through oral transmission from generation to generation. It is quite possible that Hotu Matua was a real historical figure, perhaps an authoritative chief who led his people in a great migration. The legend of the migration may have become ingrained in the islanders' collective memory precisely because it reflected real historical events. Today, thanks to archaeological research, we know that Anakina Beach was indeed one of the first places on the island to be inhabited. Traces of the oldest settlements have been discovered there, which remarkably echoes the myth, confirming its possible historical basis. Of course, it is impossible to assert with absolute certainty that Hotumatua existed exactly as the legend describes him. But one thing is perfectly clear. For the Rapa Nui people, he was not just a character from the past. He was a symbol of the beginning of their unique civilization. Over the course of several generations, this remote island was transformed into a true paradise, where a unique civilization flourished, managing to adapt to local conditions and create a completely distinctive way of life. All this took place before the emergence of the famous stone giants, the Moai. The first inhabitants of Rapa Nui settled on the fertile coastal areas, especially in Anakena Bay, surrounded by dense palm groves and with convenient access to the ocean. It is here that archaeologists have discovered ancient settlements, testifying that the islanders' lives were inextricably linked to the sea and the island's natural resources. The Rapa Nui people became masters of fishing and seabird hunting, using long and sturdy canoes skillfully carved from the wood of giant palms. Thanks to their navigational prowess and deep knowledge of the ocean, fishermen could venture far out to sea, harvesting fish and other marine products that formed a vital part of their daily diet. But agriculture was no less important. On carefully cultivated small plots of land, the island's inhabitants grew sweet potatoes, bananas, and sugarcane brought to the island by their ancestors. Agricultural work was accompanied by rituals and ceremonies designed to enlist the support of fertility spirits and deceased ancestors. A special place in the islanders' culture was occupied by the worship of ancestors and nature spirits, which formed the basis of their social and religious life. Even before the creation of the monumental statues, a tradition emerged on the island of erecting special stone platforms known as ahu. These platforms were not merely ceremonial structures, but also important centers of social life, places of worship and communion with the spirits of ancestors. Families and tribes gathered around the ahu to hold celebrations, rites and festivals dedicated to important events in the life of the community. The very first ahu were simple platforms of stones and corals, but gradually they began to evolve into more complex architectural structures. The ceremonies of the Rapa Nui people were closely linked to the natural cycles. For example, there were rituals timed to coincide with the beginning of the rainy season, the start of agricultural work, the harvest, the catching of certain species of fish, or the migration of seabirds. These ceremonies were vibrant, expressive, and accompanied by songs, dances, and theatrical performances. An important role in the rites was played by priests and elders who possessed special knowledge and authority, helping the tribe maintain harmony between people and the spirits of nature. The skill of the Rapa Nui craftsmen deserves special attention. Before the emergence of the Moai, the islanders were skilled carvers of wood and marine animal bones, as well as adept artisans in the creation of jewelry from shells, corals, and colored stones. These works of art reflected their worldview, myths, and legends, and also served important social and religious functions. But what prompted the inhabitants of Easter Island to transition from creating small ritual objects to creating the enormous stone statues that have made this island famous throughout the world? And what secrets do these enigmatic stone giants conceal? These artifacts were distinguished not only by their elegance, but also by their profound symbolic meaning. Ritual ornaments made of bird feathers, necklaces of shark teeth, and massive earrings of volcanic obsidian emphasized a person's status and affiliation to a particular clan or tribe. However, a truly remarkable element of this culture was the creation of a unique writing system known as Rongo Rongo. This system is not just mysterious, it is unique in the scope of all of Oceania, representing the only writing system invented by a Polynesian people long before the arrival of Europeans. The Rongo Rongo script astonishes with its unusual form and complexity of execution. The symbols resemble miniature images of people, birds, animals, fish, as well as various natural phenomena and abstract signs. It seems as if the wooden tablets are filled with mysterious hieroglyphs, the meaning of which is forever lost in the depths of centuries. The very name Rongo Rongo in the Rapa Nui language literally means to read aloud or chanting recitation, suggesting that these texts were once intended for ritual utterance or performance in the form of ancient chants. The Rongo Rongo texts were inscribed on wooden tablets using shark teeth or sharpened pieces of volcanic obsidian and were then carefully stored in the homes of priests and chiefs. The most amazing thing about these tablets is the way they are read. The inscriptions were made according to a special principle known as boustrophedon. That is, the lines were written alternately from right to left and from left to right, while the signs were turned upside down when changing direction. This unusual feature further complicates the decryption process and raises additional questions for scientists. To this day, just over 20 wooden tablets with Rongo Rongo texts have survived, scattered in museums around the world, from Europe to America and Chile. However, none of these tablets has been fully deciphered. Despite numerous attempts made over the past 150 years by the world's best linguists, historians, and cryptographers, no one has managed to unlock their secret. The writings seem to remain silent, defying modern science and preserving the mystery of Easter Island. Among all the tablets, one possesses a special history, shrouded in an aura of mystery and dramatic circumstances. This tablet, known as Mamari, was discovered by missionaries in the mid-19th century. Its original owner was a Rapa Nui elder, one of the last carriers of the ancient language. Shortly after the missionaries received this tablet, a large fire broke out in the house where most of the Rongo Rongo texts were stored. Almost all of the island's other ancient records were destroyed by fire, and the unique history and knowledge of the ancient people were lost forever. But the Mamari tablet miraculously escaped the fire. The missionaries took it first to Tahiti, then it ended up in Europe, and ended up in the collections of various museums, having traveled an incredible path from distant Rapa Nui to the Old World. Since then, scientists have repeatedly tried to unravel its meaning, hoping that this particular tablet contains the key to understanding all other Rongo Rongo texts. Interest in the enigmatic writing of Easter Island is particularly high today, as deciphering Rongo Rongo could open up unknown pages of Rapa Nui history to the world, shed light on the reasons for the creation of the stone statues, and explain much about the lives of the ancient islanders. But despite modern technologies, computer analysis, and careful study, the texts still hold their secrets, forcing scientists to return to them again and again. Over time, the culture of Easter Island began to transform, and sometime between the 11th and 16th centuries AD, something emerged that forever changed its history and became one of the most intriguing mysteries of the ancient world, the famous stone statues. But before we delve into the meaning and purpose of these giants, we must take a closer look at the place where these stone giants were born, the mysterious volcanic quarry of Rano Raraku. It is here, amidst ancient hills and volcanic slopes, that a true stone workshop, unparalleled in the world, is located. The Rano Raraku quarry is an extinct volcano that, for several centuries, served as a kind of workshop and cradle for the Moai. Here, the Rapa Nui masters created their stone giants, carefully carving them directly from the soft volcanic tuff. It is here, on the slopes of the volcano, that hundreds of statues can still be seen today, frozen in various stages of processing. Some are barely discernible in rough outline, while others are fully finished and detached from the rock, as if awaiting the moment when they will be moved to the coast. In total, there are more than 400 statues here, and each sculpture seems to be a silent witness to those times when an ancient civilization still flourished on the island. How did the ancient artisans craft their impressive works? The creation of a statue began directly within the rock face. Using rudimentary tools, such as small basalt stone hammers and obsidian chisels, the ancient masters gradually freed the Moai figure from the volcanic rock. The work progressed from top to bottom. The first stage involved sculpting the head and expressive face, followed by the gradual emergence of the torso and arms, folded across the stomach in a characteristic ritual pose. This process could take years, and completing the largest statues required the efforts of entire families, even generations of artisans. Each moai is unique, differing in facial features, size, and details. However, among the statues created at Rano Raraku, there are particular figures that still hold mysteries. Deep within the quarry are several enormous, unfinished statues, including the largest moai, a giant standing at approximately 70 feet tall and weighing around 200 tons. It was never fully detached from the rock and remains there like a forgotten giant on the slope of the volcano. It is around such statues that the main questions arise. Why did the ancient masters, after carrying out such complex and lengthy work, suddenly cease their efforts and leave such impressive creations unfinished? Scholars have proposed several theories to explain this enigma. Some believe that the sudden cessation of work at Rano Raraku was caused by major social conflicts or war that erupted among the island's inhabitants. Others suggest that environmental catastrophes, such as the drastic disappearance of forests, led to resource scarcity and made it impossible to continue such laborious work. Still other researchers speak of a spiritual crisis when the Rapa Nui people may have become disillusioned with their former gods and cults and ceased creating statues, believing they could no longer aid them in their struggle against a harsh reality. In addition to scientific hypotheses and archaeological discoveries, the inhabitants of Easter Island have passed down remarkable legends from generation to generation, in which the moai were not merely stone statues, but beings endowed with special powers, living their own secret lives. Among the many such tales is a wondrous story recounting a moai who one day came to life and became the protector of all of Rapa Nui. According to this ancient legend, long before Europeans first sighted Easter Island, there lived a talented and wise master carver on Rapa Nui. He was renowned for his artistry in creating moai, and each of his statues was considered exceptionally beautiful and expressive. It was said that the master invested not only physical labor into his stone giants, but also a piece of his own soul. One day, a fierce conflict erupted on the island between two warring tribes, threatening to destroy peaceful life and lead to utter ruin. The war raged ever more intensely, and no one could halt the bloodshed. Then the islanders, having lost hope, came to the elderly master and begged him to appeal to the spirits of their ancestors to help stop the terrible feud. Seeing the suffering of his people, the wise master decided to invoke the ancient powers. He went to his greatest creation, an enormous moai standing on a platform by the coast, and prayed at length, beseeching the spirits of his ancestors to protect the island from disaster. The tribal elders merely shook their heads and did not believe in the possibility of success. But at dawn the following day, something incredible happened. The people saw the huge stone statue seemingly come to life. Its eyes filled with radiance, its stone shoulders trembled, and the giant slowly stepped off its platform and headed towards the warring armies. Stunned, the warriors, upon seeing the moai come alive, were gripped by terror and awe, laid down their weapons, and ceased the battle. The stone giant strode across the battlefields and halted at the very boundary between the two tribes, as if warning them that any attempt to continue the conflict would mark the beginning of the end for the entire Rapa Nui people. It was said that its gaze possessed such power and wisdom that no one could look into its eyes without fear or a deep sense of remorse. After this event, peace returned to the island. The grateful inhabitants re-erected the statue in its place, and it froze once more, reverting to stone and its silent state. But since that time, this moai has been revered by the Rapa Nui as the protector and guardian of the island, capable, in the most difficult times, of coming alive again and defending its people. One of the most enigmatic and captivating topics associated with the Moai is the question of how the ancient inhabitants of Easter Island moved and erected these stone giants throughout the island. After all, some of the erected Moai reached incredible sizes, up to 30 or even 49 feet in height, and weighed dozens of tons. How could the islanders, lacking powerful machinery, successfully transport such colossal statues from the Rano Raraku quarry for tens of kilometers and then erect them on stone platforms along the coast? Since the discovery of Easter Island, scientists have repeatedly put forward various hypotheses to explain this mystery. What theories are most plausible, and what new discoveries have been made in recent years shedding light on this ancient riddle? The most common and long-accepted version was the assumption that the Moai were transported on wooden sledges, moving over logs from palm trees. According to this hypothesis, the inhabitants felled trees, laid the trunks across the road, and then carefully moved the statues, lying horizontally, over them. This method seemed the most realistic, but archaeologists soon encountered an important contradiction. Not enough roads or timber reserves were found on the island to transport hundreds of huge stone figures in this way. Moreover, such a method required a huge number of people and resources, which were always limited on the island. Gradually, another theory began to spread, initially appearing completely unbelievable and even fantastic. It was based on an ancient local legend which stated that the Moai themselves walked to their destination under the influence of magical spells and the prayers of priests. Of course, it is difficult to take this literally, but some researchers have suggested that a very real movement technology was hidden behind this legend, in which the statues literally stepped across the ground. In the early 21st century, researchers from America and Chile conducted a series of unique experiments to test this unusual theory. They created an exact replica of a Moai, corresponding to the size and proportions of the originals, and, using ropes and a small group of people, began to try to imitate its movement. The statue was tied with ropes around its head and shoulders and gently rocked from side to side, as if forcing it to step from one side to the other. The result was astonishing. The statue really walked, as if slowly stepping across the ground, despite the fact that it weighed several tons. This experiment showed that the ancient inhabitants of Rapa Nui could have used such a method, which required much less wood and human resources than previously thought. Furthermore, it explains the strange shape of the base of many statues, which have a rounded bottom, perfect for such movement. The use of such a walking technique for moving the Moai also explains the local legend that the statues themselves walked to the sea. Today, active discussions continue among scientists about which method the ancient islanders used, and there is still no final consensus. Most likely, the inhabitants of Easter Island could have used various methods of moving the statues, both rolling on logs and vertical stepping movement, and even combined techniques depending on the size of the statue and the distance it needed to be delivered. When we think of the statues of Easter Island, giant stone heads towering above the ground immediately come to mind. This is how the Moai are most often depicted in photographs, books, and films. However, for a long time, few people realized that these statues have complete bodies hidden beneath a layer of earth and time. The discovery that changed the perception of the Moai occurred relatively recently. For many years, travelers, researchers, and archaeologists believed that they were only heads installed on the surface of the island. However, during more detailed excavations, it became clear that many statues go several meters deep into the ground, and mysterious images and symbols have been preserved on their backs. Although the local inhabitants had always known about the existence of the underground parts of the Moai, the general public only learned about it in the 20th century. The first documented evidence appeared in 1914, when British researcher Catherine Routledge recorded that some statues had hidden torsos. But her work remained little known. The real sensation occurred in the early 21st century, when a team of archaeologists, led by Jo Ann van Tilburg, began full-scale excavations. Scientists chose several partially buried statues in the Rano quarry, where most of the moai originate, for research. When they began to dig deeper into the soil, they discovered that the statues continued down for several meters, forming complete torsos with arms extended along the body. The question arises, why were the huge statues buried in the ground? Scientists offer several explanations. One of the reasons is natural erosion. Easter Island is exposed to strong winds and rains, which, over hundreds of years, have washed away the topsoil, gradually burying the lower part of the statues. This process was especially noticeable in the Rano quarry, where natural conditions contributed to the rapid accumulation of soil. Another hypothesis is related to ritual practices. Perhaps some of the statues were deliberately buried by the ancient islanders. This could be related to changing religious beliefs or attempts to protect the moai from destruction. Finally, some statues may simply have remained in the ground during the creation process. Many unfinished statues remained in the quarry, which explains why they are so deeply buried in the earth. So, what were these enigmatic images on the backs of the moai, and what role did they play in the culture of the ancient islanders? And what led to the decline of the civilization that created these stone giants? The most unexpected discovery was the detection of carved patterns and symbols on the backs of some moai. These petroglyphs contain mysterious symbols that may shed light on the rituals and beliefs of the ancient inhabitants of the island. One of the most common motifs is the image of ring-shaped symbols, which some researchers believe may be associated with the cult of ancestors. There are also images of palms and long curved lines resembling canoes. The latter are interpreted as a possible reflection of the importance of seafaring for the Rapa Nui people, or as a symbolic reminder of the journey of their ancestors across the Pacific Ocean. Of greatest interest is the hypothesis that some of the symbols discovered may relate to the Rongo writing system. Some archaeologists are skeptical of this version, since Rongo was used on wooden tablets and had a linear structure. However, a number of researchers, such as Stephen Fisher, suggest that elements of this script may have existed as sacred symbols long before its appearance in written form. Since the appearance of the first explorers on Easter Island, disputes have been ongoing about the significance of the moai for the ancient inhabitants of the island. These stone giants were not simply works of art or random cult objects. Their creation required incredible effort, and their location on the island followed a strict system. Most researchers agree that the moai were connected with the cult of ancestors and were symbols of spiritual power, known in Polynesian culture as mana. In the beliefs of the ancient Rapa Nui people, after death, leaders and prominent members of society did not simply disappear, they became patrons of their descendants. Their spirits retained influence over the living, granting them luck, protection, and fertility, but could also deprive them of their blessing if their descendants violated traditions or desecrated sacred places. The moai, in all likelihood, played the role of intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of ancestors. By installing stone statues, the Rapa Nui people not only immortalized the memory of significant figures of the past, but also tried to keep their power close to them. Each statue likely represented a specific ancestor or leader who possessed strong mana during his lifetime. Placed on special stone platforms, they became objects of rituals and ceremonies. The taller and more massive the statue, the more powerful the clan that erected it was considered. This may have led to a kind of competition between clans, striving to erect the most magnificent moai possible. Over time, their sizes increased, and the process of construction and transportation became more and more complex, which testifies to the high significance of the statues in society. One of the most interesting features of the moai is their orientation. Almost all known statues face inward towards the island, not towards the ocean. If their purpose was to protect against external threats, it would be logical to assume that they should have been facing the sea, as if guarding the island from enemies. However, their gazes are directed at former settlements and agricultural areas. This suggests that their task was not to repel external threats, but to protect and bless the island itself and its inhabitants. The Moai seem to be watching over their descendants, controlling and protecting their lives. There is only one exception on the entire island, the Ahu Akivi platform, on which 7 statues are installed facing the ocean. This has led to many hypotheses. According to one local legend, they depict 7 scouts, whom the legendary chief Hotu Matua sent to the island even before it was settled. However, modern studies show that their orientation may be related to astronomy. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun sets exactly in front of these Moai, which could mean their connection with calendar and religious cycles. There is also evidence that the Moai played a role in the system of power. The more statues a clan controlled, the higher its status. Their construction could be a form of demonstration of the strength and wealth of the clan, and maintaining them in good condition was an important duty of descendants. If the clan weakened, its enemies could overthrow its Moai, symbolically depriving the clan of the protection of its ancestors. This could be related to the period of mass overthrow of statues that occurred in the late history of the island. In addition to their religious and social significance, the Moai may also have played a role in cult rituals related to agriculture. Some archaeologists note that the largest platforms with statues are located near ancient agricultural fields. This may mean that the statues participated in rituals related to fertility, calling on the spirits of ancestors to bless the land and ensure a good harvest. Among the hundreds of Moai remaining on Easter Island, there is one whose fate turned out completely different. What is so unique about the fate of this Moai, and what events led to the decline of the civilization that created these stone giants? It left its native land and ended up in distant Europe, becoming not only a museum exhibit, but also a symbol of loss, oblivion, and cultural alienation. This is Hoa Hakananaya, one of the most mysterious and significant stone giants of Rapa Nui. Hoa Hakananaya, which can be translated as stolen or hidden friend, was carved from rare reddish volcanic tuff and placed on a platform, probably in the Aronga area. In 1868, the British ship Topaz arrived on Easter Island. The team of researchers, led by Captain Richard Powell, impressed by the huge statues, decided to take one of them as a gift for Queen Victoria. The Moai was removed from the platform and with difficulty loaded onto the ship, after which it set off on a journey from which it was not destined to return. Upon arrival in Great Britain, the statue was transferred to the British Museum, where it soon took one of the central places in the exposition. For Western researchers of that time, it became an archaeological sensation, an exotic artifact of a distant civilization. However, for the Rapa Nui people themselves, its loss became a symbol of the violent alienation of their cultural heritage. Over time, attitudes towards this relic have changed. If in the 19th century it was perceived as a curious find, in the 21st century, Hoa Hakananaya has become a reminder of the colonial past and cultural robbery of the island. For the descendants of the Rapa Nui people, it remains not just a statue, but the spirit of ancestors who were kidnapped and are now in exile. In recent years, the island authorities have repeatedly demanded its return to its homeland, pointing out that the Moai are not just archaeological monuments, but living carriers of their cultural identity. Disputes over the return of the statue continue. The British Museum has not yet expressed its readiness to part with the exhibit, but the global trend towards the restitution of stolen artifacts gives hope that one day the statue will again be in its native land, among the descendants of those who once created it. The loss of Hoa Hakananaya became for the Rapa Nui people a symbol not only of colonial looting, but also of a deep break with their own past. However, this break began long before the arrival of Europeans. By the time the first European ships reached Easter Island, The ancient Rapa Nui civilization was already experiencing a difficult period of decline. Giant statues, which had stood on their platforms for centuries, were overthrown, ancient traditions were violated, and society itself entered an era of instability. For a long time, it was believed that the cause of this collapse was ecological self-destruction. According to a popular theory, the inhabitants of the island themselves cut off the branch they were sitting on. For the sake of transporting the moai, they mercilessly cut down forests, which led to the destruction of the ecosystem, famine, and internecine wars. This scenario, especially actively promoted in the mid-20th century, portrayed Rapa Nui as a warning to all mankind, an example of a civilization that destroyed itself with its own greed and unreasonable use of natural resources. However, modern studies show that the reality was much more complex, and the version of the islanders' self-destruction is far from the truth. For the first time, the hypothesis of ecological collapse gained wide popularity thanks to the work of Jared Diamond, author of the book Collapse. He suggested that the Rapa Nui people cut down the entire forest to transport the statues, and when the trees ran out, they lost the ability to build boats, fish, and maintain agriculture. As a result, the island plunged into chaos, wars, mass starvation, and cannibalism began. For many years, the image of Easter Island as an impoverished, lifeless place, exhausted to the limit by nature itself and by the hands of its inhabitants, has dominated scientific circles. This picture was largely based on the descriptions of the first Europeans to arrive on the island in the 18th century. They saw before them a place almost devoid of trees, with poor vegetation and windswept hills. However, modern archaeological research allows us to take a fresh look at this issue. Studies of soil layers conducted in recent decades have yielded unexpected results. Paleobotanical analyses of pollen preserved in ancient sediments have shown that the island was once covered with dense forests, consisting of several species of palms, including the Easter Island palm, a species that has now completely disappeared. Traces of other plants were also found, indicating a richer ecosystem than previously thought. However, the key question is how quickly and why these forests disappeared. In recent years, a hypothesis has emerged that it was not people who played the main role in the disappearance of forests, but the animals they brought with them. One of the most curious finds in this context is related to an experiment with palm nuts. Archaeologists have discovered a significant number of remnants of Easter Island palm nuts in the soil layers, but almost all of them were gnawed by rats' teeth. So, what role did these rodents play in the island's fate, and what truly led to the decline of the ancient Rapa Nui civilization? This discovery sparked a hypothesis that the rats brought over by the Polynesians, lacking natural predators, rapidly multiplied and began to actively consume palm seeds, hindering their natural regeneration. To test this theory, researchers conducted a laboratory experiment, recreating the conditions in which ancient Easter Island palms might have existed. It turned out that if the rat population remained uncontrolled, they could destroy nearly 100% of the palm seeds, preventing them from germinating. This meant that even if people cut down trees, their natural recovery was impossible due to the destructive impact of the rodents. Thus, a new perspective on the ecological history of Easter Island reveals that the process of forest loss was not so much the result of deliberate destruction as the result of complex processes that included both human activity and the unforeseen consequences of introducing new species. At the same time, archaeological evidence suggests that even after the loss of forests, the islanders were not completely deprived of resources. They developed sophisticated adaptation methods, including so-called stone gardens, an agricultural system in which volcanic stones were used to conserve soil moisture and protect plants from wind erosion. This proves that the islanders were aware of the importance of ecology and took measures to preserve natural resources. Furthermore, No evidence of mass starvation or a sharp demographic collapse, which, according to old theories, should have accompanied the disaster, has been found. On the contrary, studies indicate that even after the disappearance of the forests, the Rapa Nui continued to conduct economic activities and maintained a stable social structure until European contact. However, at some point, their social order cracked, and this led to one of the most dramatic events in the island's history, the mass overthrow of the Moai. When Europeans first landed on Rapa Nui in the 18th century, they saw already collapsed statues lying face down or broken into pieces. This sparked many hypotheses. Were the Moai destroyed in wars between clans? Or was their overthrow an act of spiritual protest against the old belief system? The answer to this question remains a matter of scientific debate, but archaeological finds help shed light on the events that led to the collapse of the ancient order. Rapa Nui had long been a society based on a clan system where power was inherited, and the status of each lineage was confirmed by its Moai. The larger and more impressive the statue, the higher the prestige of the clan to which it belonged. However, by the time of European contact, this system had already begun to crumble. Analysis of archaeological data shows that the overthrow of the Moai did not happen all at once, but stretched over several decades. Traces of destruction found on various platforms indicate that the statues were dropped with varying degrees of force. Some lie neatly, as if they were lowered carefully, while others are shattered to pieces, as if they were deliberately dropped from a height. This suggests that the overthrow may have occurred both as a result of violent conflicts and in the course of a conscious rejection of old traditions. One possible cause of this process could have been internal strife. The weakening of central authority, the scarcity of resources, and the increasing competition between clans may have led to a surge of violence. If, previously, the status of a clan was determined by the size of its Moai, then, in a crisis, destroying a rival's statue could become a symbolic act demonstrating their defeat. Some researchers suggest that the overthrow of the Moai may have been related to a spiritual transformation of society. The gradual loss of faith in the power of ancestors and their protection could have rendered the statues unnecessary, or perhaps even dangerous relics of the past. During this same period, the cult of Tangata Manu, the Birdman, gained strength on the island, largely replacing the former system of worship. It is possible that new beliefs came into conflict with old traditions, leading to the mass destruction of statues. Among the Rapa Nui, a legend has been preserved about a chief who first dared to topple a Moai, thus initiating the destruction of the ancient order. This story was passed down from generation to generation, filled with mystical details, and even today it remains an important part of local folklore. According to the legend, the chief of one of the powerful clans, whose name has been lost to the ages, came to the conclusion that the Moai no longer possessed the power of the ancestors and were unable to protect his people. Then the chief made a radical decision to destroy the symbol of the former power and prove that the stone giants did not possess divine power. At night, by the light of the moon, he and his warriors went to one of the platforms where the ancient Moai of his lineage stood. People grabbed the ropes fastened around the statue's head and began to pull, shouting. The giant slowly tilted, and then, with a dull thud, collapsed face down. What happened after the overthrow of the Moai, and what new beliefs captured the minds of the islanders? And how does the tragic history of Easter Island resonate with the problems facing humanity today? At that moment, according to legend, the earth trembled, and a gust of wind swept over the island, like a warning from the spirits of the ancestors. The chief hoped that the destruction of the statue would bring power to his clan, but he was wrong. Soon after, his family became involved in a brutal internecine struggle. Some said that this was a natural consequence of the weakening of traditional authority. Others, that the chief and his descendants were cursed by the spirits whose image was destroyed. According to legend, all his heirs either died in bloody clashes or were exiled, and he himself died in solitude, forever remaining in the memory of the Rapa Nui as the man who dared to defy the ancestors. If the legend of the chief's curse remains in the realm of myth, then the traces of the brutal conflicts that accompanied the period of the fall of the Moai are quite real. Archaeological research has shown that a wave of violence began on the island during this period, confirmed by numerous finds. Stone weapons were discovered throughout the territory, mainly sharpened obsidian spearheads and throwing darts. These artifacts indicate that a society previously focused on construction and rituals had turned into a battlefield for survival. In addition, analysis of the remains found in ancient settlements revealed traces of injuries inflicted by weapons, as well as fractures characteristic of hand-to-hand combat. All this indicates that the end of the Moai era was overshadowed by a period of bloody clashes. In addition to internal conflicts and the destruction of the traditional order, another powerful factor began to influence the fate of the Rapa Nui: contact with the outside world. For centuries, the island remained isolated, and its inhabitants were unaware of the existence of other peoples. But starting in the 18th century, ships began to appear on the horizon, and each new visit from foreigners became a test for Rapa Nui, changing the course of its history. These encounters with the outside world were far from equal. They brought with them violence, disease, slavery, and ultimately the transformation of the island into a colony. The first Europeans to see Easter Island were sailors from the Dutch expedition of Jacob Roggeveen, which arrived here on April 5, 1722. The contact itself turned out to be brief and far from friendly. The Dutch landed on the shore, but a conflict soon broke out between them and the local residents, as a result of which several Rapa Nui were killed. What exactly caused the clash is unknown. Perhaps the islanders tried to steal something from the Europeans, or conversely, the sailors themselves behaved aggressively. Be that as it may, Roggeveen soon left the island, leaving the first description of its inhabitants and mysterious stone statues. More than 50 years later, in 1774, the famous British captain James Cook arrived on Rapa Nui. His expedition recorded much more detail about the lives of the local residents than Roggeveen had described. By that time, the Rapa Nui civilization had already undergone significant changes. The Moai had been overthrown, the clans were scattered, and the population, according to eyewitnesses, looked exhausted. Cook noted that the island's inhabitants were poorly dressed, their dwellings were extremely primitive, and their food was scarce. This description was long used as proof of the collapse of the island civilization, but today researchers understand that the Europeans may have caught the Rapa Nui during a difficult period of social transformation rather than complete decline. The real catastrophe for the island's population began in the 19th century, when Rapa Nui became embroiled in the global slave trade. In 1862, Peruvian slave traders arrived on its shores, hunting for labor for the mines. The Rapa Nui, who knew nothing about the slave-owning world outside their island, became easy prey. In a short time, about 1,500 islanders, which was almost half of the entire population, were captured and sent to Peru, where they faced hard labor in unbearable conditions. When, after several years, the international community forced the Peruvian authorities to stop the slave trade, some of the Rapa Nui were returned to their homeland. However, of the more than 1,500 abducted, only 15 managed to return. These people brought with them deadly diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery, against which the islanders had no immunity. The epidemic that broke out soon after their arrival claimed the lives of most of the people remaining on Rapa Nui. By the end of the 19th century, only a handful of survivors remained from the once thriving people, about 150 people. Many cultural traditions were lost, writing was forgotten, and the island itself gradually turned into a colonial territory. In 1888, it officially came under the control of Chile, and its inhabitants became virtual prisoners on their own land, as a significant part of the island was turned into a sheep farm, and the Rapa Nui themselves into hired workers deprived of rights. But even in these difficult times, there were people among the Rapa Nui who were destined to play an important role in preserving their culture. How did these few survivors manage to preserve their identity? And what lessons can we learn from the tragic history of Easter Island to build a sustainable future? At that moment, according to legend, the earth trembled, and a gust of wind swept over the island, like a warning from the spirits of the ancestors. The chieftain hoped that destroying the statue would bring power to his clan, but he was mistaken. Soon after, his family became embroiled in a brutal internecine conflict. Some said it was a natural consequence of the weakening of traditional authority, others that the chieftain and his descendants were cursed by the spirits whose images had been destroyed. According to law, all of his heirs either perished in bloody clashes or were exiled, and he himself died alone, forever remembered by the Rapa Nui people as the man who dared to defy the ancestors. While the legend of the chieftain's curse remains in the realm of myth, the traces of the brutal conflicts that accompanied the fall of the Moai are quite real. Archaeological investigations have shown that a wave of violence began on the island during this period, confirmed by numerous finds. Stone weapons were discovered throughout the territory, mainly sharpened obsidian spearheads and throwing darts. These artifacts indicate that a society previously focused on construction and rituals had turned into a battleground for survival. Furthermore, analysis of remains found in ancient settlements revealed traces of weapon-inflicted injuries, as well as fractures typical of hand-to-hand combat. All this testifies to the fact that the end of the Moai era was overshadowed by a period of bloody clashes. In addition to internal conflicts and the destruction of the traditional way of life, another powerful factor began to influence the fate of the Rapa Nui people: contact with the outside world. For centuries, the island remained isolated, and its inhabitants were unaware of the existence of other peoples. But beginning in the 18th century, ships began to appear on the horizon, and each new visit by foreigners became a trial for Rapa Nui, changing the course of its history. These encounters with the outside world were far from equal. They brought with them violence, disease, slavery, and ultimately the transformation of the island into a colony. The first Europeans to see Easter Island were sailors from the Dutch expedition of Jacob Roggeveen, which arrived here on April 5, 1722. The contact itself was brief and far from friendly. The Dutch landed on the shore, but a conflict soon broke out between them and the local inhabitants, resulting in the deaths of several Rapa Nui people. What exactly caused the clash is unknown. Perhaps the islanders tried to steal something from the Europeans, or conversely, the sailors themselves behaved aggressively. In any case, Roggeveen soon left the island, leaving behind the first description of its inhabitants and the enigmatic stone statues. More than 50 years later, in 1774, the famous British captain James Cook arrived on Rapa Nui. His expedition recorded far more details about the lives of the local inhabitants than Roggeveen had. By that time, the Rapa Nui civilization had already undergone significant changes. The Moai had been overthrown, the clans were fragmented, and the population, according to eyewitnesses, looked exhausted. Cook noted that the islanders were poorly clothed, their dwellings were extremely primitive, and their food was scarce. This description was long used as evidence of the collapse of the island civilization, but today researchers understand that the Europeans may have caught the Rapa Nui people in a complex period of social transformation, not complete decline. The real disaster for the island's population began in the 19th century, when Rapa Nui was drawn into the global slave trade. In 1862, Peruvian slave traders arrived on its shores, hunting for labor for the mines. The Rapa Nui people, who knew nothing about the slave-owning world outside their island, became easy prey. In a short time, about 1,500 islanders, which was almost half of the entire population, were captured and sent to Peru, where they faced hard labor in unbearable conditions. When a few years later, the international community forced the Peruvian authorities to end the slave trade, some of the Rapa Nui people were returned to their homeland. However, out of more than 1,500 abducted, only 15 managed to return. These people brought with them deadly diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery, against which the islanders had no immunity. The epidemic that broke out shortly after their arrival claimed the lives of most of the people remaining on Rapa Nui. By the end of the 19th century, only a handful of survivors remained from the once thriving people, about 150 people. Many cultural traditions were lost, writing was forgotten, and the island itself gradually turned into a colonial territory. In 1888, it officially came under the control of Chile, and its inhabitants became virtual prisoners on their own land, as a significant part of the island was turned into a sheep farm, and the Rapa Nui people themselves became wage laborers, deprived of rights. But even in these difficult times, there were people among the Rapa Nui who were destined to play an important role in preserving their culture. How did these few survivors manage to preserve their identity? And what lessons can we learn from the tragic history of Easter Island to build a sustainable future? Perhaps the numerous upheavals, such as the disappearance of forests, wars between clans, and the arrival of foreigners, made them doubt that stone statues were really capable of protecting the island. Birds, on the contrary, became a symbol of renewal and hope, because they arrived every spring, bringing new life. One of the most mysterious parables of Easter Island is connected with the cult of the Birdman, the legend of the last priest of Tangata Manu, who predicted the fate of Rapa Nui and mysteriously disappeared. According to legend, at the end of the Birdman era, there lived a powerful priest who possessed the gift of prophecy. He served at the Orongo sanctuary and knew that great changes were inevitable. One day, while watching the sky, he saw a sign. Stars that, according to him, should never move, suddenly changed their position. Then he gathered the elders and uttered a prophecy. Soon people whiter than sand will come and bring dark times. The moai will fall, blood will mix, and the words of the ancestors will be forgotten. The island will become small and the people weak, but our descendants will remember who they are, and then the spirit of Rapa Nui will awaken again. After that, the priest left the village and went towards Orongo. No one ever saw him again. Some say that he threw himself into the sea and disappeared into the waves, others that he turned into a bird and flew west, to return when his people are again ready to receive the knowledge of their ancestors. This prophecy was passed down from mouth to mouth for a long time, and today many Rapa Nui people see in it a reflection of real historical events. The colonization of the island, the loss of traditions, and the modern revival of Rapa Nui culture. Centuries have passed since the cult of the Birdman disappeared, and the last moai were overthrown. The island has undergone many changes, but its people have preserved their culture and continue to live on the land of their ancestors. Today, Rapa Nui is a place where ancient traditions exist alongside modern realities, and the legacy of the past becomes the foundation for the future. In our day, Easter Island is part of Chile, but its inhabitants, descendants of the ancient Polynesians, possess a unique identity. About 7,000 people live here, and half of them are Rapa Nui. Their language, passed down from generation to generation, remains an important part of the culture, and family traditions still feel connected to the ancient past. The main source of income for the islanders has become tourism. Thousands of travelers come to Hangaroa, the only town on the island, to see the statues, visit ancient sanctuaries, and feel the energy of this place. Locals work as guides, create traditional jewelry, and develop the hotel business. Thanks to the tourist flow, many crafts are preserved, and ancient legends continue to live in the stories of guides and the tales of elders. A special place in the life of the island is occupied by Tapati. This is the largest festival of Rapa Nui, which takes place every year. For 2 weeks, the island turns into a center of competitions, dances, and rituals. Festival participants demonstrate strength and agility, repeating the feats of their ancestors. The exciting haka pay competition gathers many spectators. Men race down the slopes of the volcano, sitting on banana tree trunks, accelerating to 70 kilometers per hour. Music, ritual dances, and the stories of elders create an atmosphere in which ancient culture comes to life. There has always been a balance between tradition and change on the island. The development of tourism opens up new opportunities, and the connection with ancestors gives strength to preserve the heritage. The question of the future of Rapa Nui remains an important topic for its inhabitants, and they continue to seek a path that will allow the culture to flourish in a new era. Century after century, the statues have stood on Easter Island, enduring wars, the fall of civilization, and devastating contacts with the outside world. They have withstood storms, earthquakes, and time. But today, they face a new threat that the ancient Rapa Nui people never encountered. Modern research shows that many moai are threatened with destruction due to erosion, climate change, and human impact. Despite the fact that the statues are carved from durable volcanic tuff, centuries of rain, wind, and tides are gradually destroying their surface, erasing ancient features. The statues located right on the coast are particularly affected. They are exposed to seawater, and rising ocean levels threaten to flood some of them. The greatest concern is caused by the moai in the Ahu Tongariki area, the largest ritual platform on the island, where 15 restored statues are located. Researchers note that due to frequent storms and high humidity, their stone surface is covered with microcracks, which over time can lead to their destruction. Another vulnerable area is the moai on Anakina Beach. Here, sand, wind, and sun are gradually abrading the ancient faces of the statues, and the constant presence of tourists accelerates the erosion process. The scientific community and the island's authorities are looking for ways to protect the moai. Some scientists propose covering them with special protective compounds that slow down the destruction of the stone. What additional measures are being taken to preserve the cultural heritage of Easter Island? And what lessons can the history of Rapa Nui offer modern humanity as it faces global challenges? Some believe that the statues, which are in critical condition, should be moved to museums to preserve them for future generations. However, the Rapa Nui people have a different view. The moai belong to the land and should not be separated from it. Among those who continue to preserve the ancient knowledge of the statues is the last Rapa Nui master who knows the secrets of working with stone. His name is known only to the locals, and the Rapa Nui people simply call him Katua, which means old stone. He grew up listening to the stories of the elders about how the moai were created, and he has dedicated his life to studying ancient methods of stone processing. Katua can determine the origin of each moai by the hue of its surface. He knows which stone tools his ancestors used, and he claims that the secret of the moai is not only in their form, but also in their location. He says that the Rapa Nui people positioned the statues so that they were in balance with the wind and the sun, which helped them last longer. When asked if new moai can be carved today in the same way as the ancient masters did, he replies, "We can make the stone the same, but without faith, it will not become a moai." The history of Easter Island is the story of a people who have gone through severe trials, experienced loss, but preserved their culture and spirit. The moai, which once symbolized the power of ancestors, continue to stand on Rapa Nui land, reminding us of the past and making us think about the future. Today, the Rapa Nui people, like their ancestors, are seeking a balance between tradition and change. Their language, rituals, and crafts live on, despite the influence of the modern world. The moai, despite natural threats and human impact, remain the guardians of the island, and the people continue to care for their heritage. Rapa Nui is not a vanished civilization, but a living culture that changes but does not lose itself. The story of Easter Island is not over. It continues right now.